It began on a Thursday morning the world almost overlooked. The sun had just risen over Ouagadougou, casting a golden haze across quiet streets. But inside the presidential compound, a storm was already gathering. For 15 years, a hidden web had been spinning across Africa. It wasn't woven with silk, but with fiber optic cables and satellite signals. It carried no venom, only the cold precision of surveillance mapping mineral riches, listening to private conversations, and watching millions of African citizens through cameras they never agreed to. The mastermind, according to intercepted intelligence, was not some nameless figure in a distant office, but one of the most powerful men in the Middle East, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Western media dismissed the idea. Some African advisors warned it was too dangerous to confront. Even a few voices inside the government whispered that standing up to such a network was political suicide. But the young leader at the center of this story, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, knew that silence would cost far more than courage ever could. And so, as the city awoke, he gave an order that would shake not only Burkina Faso, but the entire continent, Operation Clearsight. 17 targets, 0 leaks, no mercy. What happened next was not just a counterintelligence mission, it was the opening move in a battle for Africa's digital soul. In one day, hidden rooms of servers, encrypted links to Tel Aviv, and the personal data of millions were exposed to daylight. The message to the world was unmistakable. Africa will no longer be your blind spot. But here's the question you must ask yourself. Can one nation's defiance truly rewrite the rules of global power? Or will the empire of surveillance simply adapt and tighten its grip? If you believe the truth matters more than the headlines, stay with us. Because what happened that Thursday morning is a blueprint for how Africa and perhaps the world can take back its sovereignty in the digital age. The story truly began 3 weeks before that Thursday morning, when Ibrahim Traoré's intelligence chief stepped into his office carrying a plain unmarked folder. Inside, page after page of intercepted communications, bank records, and satellite imagery told a story no African leader ever wanted to believe but could no longer deny. The evidence revealed that Israeli-backed companies were not simply doing business in Burkina Faso. They were mapping the nation's mineral deposits with military accuracy. They had penetrated political meetings by compromising local telecommunication systems. They were tracking citizens' movements with facial recognition networks that had been installed without public consent. And then came the detail that turned unease into outrage. This stolen information was being handed over to multinational corporations. It was being used to negotiate better deals, better for them, worse for every African government involved. Africa's own data was being weaponized against her. That night, the president didn't sleep. Alone in his office, he weighed the risks. The voices of caution around him warned that taking on such a network backed not just by Israel, but by powerful Western allies could provoke political isolation, economic sanctions, or worse. But to Traoré, the greater danger was doing nothing. Every day the network remained in place, Africa's sovereignty was quietly eroded. By dawn, his decision was made. At 5:00 a.m., he summoned his top military commanders. The orders were clear. Operation Clearsight begins in 2 hours. There would be no leaks, no delays, and no mercy. At exactly 7:00 a.m., while most of Ouagadougou was still shaking off sleep, coordinated teams moved in on 17 separate targets across the city. The first raid was on the eastern edge of town, at what appeared to be a perfectly ordinary telecommunications office. Glass-paneled windows, a corporate logo out front, employees arriving with coffee cups in hand. But appearances lied. The soldiers entered without warning. Inside, they found rows of high-powered servers capable of monitoring the communications of half the continent. Hard drives held personal data on over 2 million Burkina citizens. There were encrypted satellite phones connected directly to Israeli intelligence offices. Filing cabinets bulged with thousands of documents detailing systematic breaches of the nation's security. And this was only the first site. By 9:00 a.m., 6 more facilities had been secured. Each one followed the same pattern, hidden in plain sight, dressed up as development agencies, tech startups, or humanitarian NGOs. Behind the cover stories lay sophisticated intelligence posts stocked with surveillance hardware and data waiting to be exported to foreign servers. The pattern was chillingly consistent: mass surveillance tools aimed at African populations, data extracted without consent, communications bypassing national security protocols, a direct pipeline of sensitive information flowing to foreign capitals. As the raids unfolded, the president knew that exposing the truth would not be enough. The world needed to see action. At noon, he walked before the cameras and delivered a line he had been holding back for months. Africa is no longer your laboratory. We are no longer your test subjects, and we are definitely no longer your blind spot. The words were aimed at more than the press. They were a direct challenge to Benjamin Netanyahu himself, a signal that the quiet era of compliance was over. The effects were immediate. Within hours, leaders from across West Africa began calling. Mali's president admitted they had discovered similar installations in Bamako. Guinea's military council reported that they had been tracking suspicious Israeli-linked activities, but had hesitated to act for fear of diplomatic fallout. Traore told them plainly, "Stop worrying about incidents, shut them down." By nightfall, 3 neighboring countries had frozen all imports of Israeli military technology. 4 others had begun emergency audits of their foreign-backed infrastructure projects. Inside the African Union, whispers began about a unified continental strategy to combat foreign intelligence infiltration, something never before attempted. But as dramatic as these revelations were, what truly unsettled Netanyahu's government was what came next. Evidence showed the Israeli operations were not acting alone. The surveillance web linked back to intelligence agencies in France, Britain, and the United States. It wasn't a single thread, it was a tapestry of foreign interests, each taking its share of Africa's secrets. In Traore's mind, the fight was no longer about Israeli overreach. It was about dismantling a colonial mindset that had merely traded warships for algorithms and gunboats for data centers. The stage was set for a confrontation that would move far beyond Burkina Faso's borders, a confrontation that would redefine the way Africa engaged with the rest of the world in the digital age. By the time the last raid team reported site secured, the clock had barely struck noon. The president knew that this was the moment to step into the light. Cameras from across the region had already gathered outside the presidential compound, drawn by whispers of an unprecedented operation. Ibrahim Traoré didn't waste the moment. Standing in front of the national flag, his voice steady but charged with energy, he declared, "Africa is no longer your laboratory. We are no longer your test subjects, and we are definitely no longer your blind spot." The words rippled outward, carried by live broadcasts and social media feeds across the continent. They were not the cautious phrasing of a press release. They were a line drawn in the sand. In Bamako, Mali's president picked up the phone almost immediately. "Ibrahim," he said, "we found similar operations here. What do we do?" "Shut them down," came the reply. "All of them." From Conakry, Guinea's military leadership reported that they too had been monitoring suspicious activities linked to Israeli contractors, but had hesitated for fear of diplomatic backlash. Traoré told them the time for hesitation was over. By early evening, the dominoes were falling. 3 West African nations froze imports of Israeli military technology. 4 more launched emergency audits of foreign-backed infrastructure. The African Union convened a private meeting to discuss for the first time a continental strategy to counter foreign intelligence infiltration. But the real shock to Netanyahu's government was buried in the seized evidence. The data revealed deep coordination between Israeli operations and intelligence services from France, Britain, and the United States. It wasn't just one nation spying, it was a network, a consortium of power treating Africa's communications resources and political life as commodities to be traded. That night, an Israeli diplomat called Traore, directly demanding to know on what authority he had acted. His answer was short, on the authority of a sovereign nation that refuses to be spied on by foreign powers. 2 days later came the more delicate call from Netanyahu himself. President Traoré, the Israeli leader, began, "I think there's been a misunderstanding about our activities in your region." "The only misunderstanding," Traoré replied, "was thinking we wouldn't notice." Netanyahu tried to frame the Israeli presence as development work, job creation, infrastructure building. Traoré cut him off. "When you build infrastructure that spies on the people it's supposed to serve, that's not development. That's occupation with better marketing." The call lasted just 12 minutes. Netanyahu never called again. Israel's counterattack was swift and predictable. Media outlets in Tel Aviv accused Traoré of destabilizing the region. European newspapers published op-eds questioning his authoritarian tendencies. The same publications, Traoré noted, had never once questioned the legality of foreign intelligence posts operating openly in African nations. But the propaganda blitz fell flat where it mattered most among young Africans. They no longer relied on European news to tell them what was happening in their own countries. They could see for themselves that the language of partnership and cooperation had been used to justify exploitation. The reaction on the streets of Ouagadougou was unlike anything the president had seen before. By nightfall on the day of the raids, thousands had gathered outside the presidential compound. They carried hand-painted signs, "Our data, our choice, and Africa is not for sale." The atmosphere was electric, not one of protest, but of celebration. University students organized teach-ins on digital sovereignty. Civil society groups began holding forums about technological independence. Even political opponents of the president admitted, sometimes grudgingly, that what had been uncovered demanded action. Private leaders from across Africa began to open up. Presidents, prime ministers, and military commanders called or sent envoys sharing intelligence they had previously kept locked away. What emerged was a disturbing continental map of surveillance with lines stretching from west to east, north to south, a network far too vast for any single country to dismantle alone. It was in these quiet after-hours conversations that the seed of a new idea took root. Africa needed its own collective defense in the digital age. Not just stronger national laws, but a unified doctrine, one designed by Africans for Africans. That doctrine would soon be named the Continental Digital Sovereignty Framework. And while the framework itself would be debated, refined, and challenged in the months to come, its birth was here in the aftershock of a Thursday morning when one nation decided to stop being the subject of someone else's experiment. The raids had been the action. The framework would be the strategy. And the message to the world was clear: this was not a moment. It was the start of a movement. The morning after Operation Clearsight, the streets of Ouagadougou felt different. The air was lighter yet charged. Conversations in markets and cafes circled back to the same subject: the raids, the evidence, the president's words. For years, digital surveillance had been an abstract concept for most citizens, something whispered about in activist circles or hidden in the fine print of international contracts. Now it was tangible. People had seen the images: racks of servers humming in dark rooms, stacks of hard drives labeled with citizens' names, encrypted lines to foreign capitals. They understood, perhaps for the first time, that their personal lives had been turned into commodities. The public's reaction was not fear, it was ownership. That night, thousands returned to the presidential compound carrying banners that read, "Our data, our choice, and Africa is not for sale." The gathering was spontaneous, not organized by any political party. Street musicians played, poets recited verses about sovereignty, and families came with their children to witness what they called the day the blindfold came off. Civil society groups moved quickly. Universities began hosting teach-ins on digital sovereignty, inviting lawyers, engineers, and human rights advocates to explain how data control shapes political and economic power. Community radio stations broadcast discussions on how ordinary people could protect their privacy. In villages far from the capital, elders connected the struggle for digital independence to older battles against land seizures, against resource exploitation, against colonial rule. Inside government halls, the mood shifted from isolation to cooperation. Leaders from across the continent, some democratic, others military, began reaching out privately. Many had long suspected foreign intelligence interference, but lacked either the proof or the courage to act. Now, with Burkina Faso's example, they felt the tide turning. In a series of encrypted meetings, presidents, prime ministers, and security chiefs from 6 West African nations began sharing their own findings. They mapped out a continent-wide picture of surveillance, Israeli-linked in some places, but also tied to French, British, and American networks. The sheer scale made it clear no single nation could handle this alone. It was in these discussions that the idea for the Continental Digital Sovereignty Framework took shape. The principles were bold but clear: absolute transparency for any foreign investment in telecommunications and data infrastructure, mandatory African-led audits of all foreign tech companies operating on the continent, zero tolerance for undeclared intelligence activity. A unified African response: what harms one nation's security is treated as a threat to all. And the most revolutionary clause: African data stays in Africa unless explicitly authorized to leave. Critics warned the framework would be costly, that it might scare away foreign investment. But for supporters, that was the point. Partnerships would be based not on desperation, but on mutual respect and clear rules. The political implications were immediate. In parliaments from Accra to Addis Ababa, lawmakers began asking questions about their own telecom contracts. Opposition leaders, sensing the shift in public opinion, avoided attacking the policy outright. Even in countries with close Western ties, ministers privately admitted they were exploring versions of Burkina Faso's approach. At the grassroots level, something more subtle but equally powerful was happening. The idea of sovereignty was no longer an abstract political slogan. It had become personal. Citizens were talking about it at bus stops, in barbershops, in classrooms. Parents told their children, "Your information is yours, not theirs." The raids had exposed more than cables and servers. They had exposed a mindset that Africa was open ground for extraction, whether of gold, oil, or data. And in shattering that mindset, Burkina Faso had not only defended its borders in the digital age, it had lit a beacon for others to follow. In Washington, the reaction was cautious, almost too quiet. Publicly, U.S. officials spoke of monitoring developments and reaffirmed their commitment to partnerships in African development. Privately, the conversation was far less diplomatic. According to African diplomats, American intelligence officers admitted they were reassessing certain data collection practices, not out of goodwill, but because they feared the precedent Burkina Faso had set. For decades, the United States had relied on an unspoken arrangement. Africa's digital infrastructure could be influenced, even controlled, as long as it was framed as cooperation. Operation Clearsight shattered that illusion. By putting transparency at the center of all foreign partnerships, Traoré's government had created a model. Others could adopt a model that, if copied widely, would make it harder for the U.S. and its allies to operate covertly. In Europe, the reaction split sharply. France and Britain, both implicated in the seized intelligence files, doubled down on defending their security partnerships in Africa. But smaller European nations, and even some private tech firms, saw an opportunity. They began branding themselves as African digital sovereignty compliant, a badge meant to signal they could do business without spying. Then came the unexpected twist. Countries often accused of heavy-handed digital control, like China and Russia, expressed willingness to meet Burkina Faso's transparency requirements. For them, the calculation was simple. If agreeing to audits and local data storage opened doors in African markets, it was worth the concession. Across the global south, the ripple effect was unmistakable. Morocco restricted foreign data collection. Kenya ordered a full review of its international telecom contracts. Nigeria passed a law requiring foreign companies to store all citizen data within national borders. South Africa, typically cautious about challenging Western partners, announced that African infrastructure should serve African interests first. For the U.S. and its allies, this was the most unsettling part. The conversation had shifted. What started as a regional operation in a landlocked West African nation was now part of a global debate about who owns information, who controls technology, and whose rules the digital world will follow. Burkina Faso had forced the question onto the table. And in the halls of power from Washington to Brussels, policymakers understood one thing: once a continent starts demanding digital sovereignty, it's almost impossible to put that demand back in the box. 6 months after Operation Clearsight, Burkina Faso's internet speeds were faster, its telecom costs lower, and its data infrastructure more secure than ever before. The foreign contracts once praised as essential had been replaced with transparent partnerships. For the first time in years, citizens knew their government was protecting their information rather than trading it away. But Ibrahim Traoré's closing message was not one of self-congratulation. It was a warning. The forces that had been exposed would not simply disappear. Networks that took decades to build would adapt, rebrand, and attempt to regain their foothold. Surveillance capitalism, like any profitable enterprise, does not surrender quietly. And this is where the real test lies, not in the victory of a single Thursday morning, but in the vigilance that follows. Sovereignty is not a trophy to be placed on a shelf. It is a responsibility renewed every day against threats both seen and unseen. Traoré was clear: this is not anti-Western nor anti-Israeli. It is pro-African pragmatism, the belief that partnerships must be built on respect and transparency, or not at all. The door is open to any nation willing to meet those terms. For those who cannot, Africa will find other partners. For the rest of the world, the lesson is equally stark. If a landlocked nation with limited resources can expose and dismantle a network of some of the world's most advanced intelligence agencies, then the myth of inevitability is broken. The era of assuming African consent is over. The only question now is how quickly global powers can adapt to this new reality and how much it will cost them if they don't. So I ask you, do you believe President Ibrahim Traoré's digital sovereignty doctrine can truly shield Africa from the next wave of foreign exploitation? Or will the empire of surveillance find a new way in? Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines.